Hey everyone. So I figured today is the perfect time of the year to have a look at this beautiful book that I picked up on my last visit to Paris. It's on the Devil, le Diable, un mythe à redécouvrir en 40 notices. And I figured we could explore the history of the devil together. I really love the way this is put together, where it gives you a bit of a historic overview on how this image of the devil developed and changed. And what I thought was really interesting is that it starts here in the 6th century, le 6e siècle. And it says, première image connue du diable à Ravenne. So the first known image of the devil only appears in the 6th century in a mosaic in Ravenna in Italy. And even that is contested, it's not quite certain whether it really shows a devil. I don't have an image of it in here, but basically what it shows is Jesus at the center, and there are 2 angels behind him, one in red and one in blue. And it is thought that the one in blue represents the devil. But there's nothing about it that would give it away. If we think of the devil today, it's probably a figure like this one that springs to mind. A beast with horns, a somewhat grotesque expression with its tongue hanging out. You might have claws or hooves, which we can't see here. But there's no doubt about it, right? We see this and we know it's a devil, or at least some kind of demon. But the mosaic in Ravenna might just show an angel that represents the night or darkness, hence why it's created in blue. So it really took a while, until the Middle Ages really, for this kind of image to develop. What we think of as the devil though, or at least the figure that inspired it, is a bit older, of course. Satan turns up in the Old Testament, but not really as a devil in the sense of a figure that opposes God. Satan is just a title that can be given to any angel. It's used with an indefinite article. So for example, the angel Samael might appear in the role of a Satan, which means an accuser or an adversary. He acts on God's behalf. So whatever he does when he accuses someone or tests someone's faith, it's according to God's will. That, for example, turns up in the story of Job, where a Satan decides to take everything away from Job and throw him into misery to test his faith, and then later goes back to God to report on what he's found. And God's fine with it and rewards Job because he didn't lose faith. So Satan isn't an independent figure. It's just one angel among the many other ones. This idea that good and bad are opposing forces might come from a bit further east. A bit further east than that even. We don't even have it on the map anymore. If we go to Iran, or what is present-day Iran, you have Zoroastrianism, which still exists, but in antiquity was a really popular and really widespread religion that posited that the good forces, the good god Ahura Mazda, and the bad god Ahriman were opposing one another. And that kind of worldview kind of made it into some Roman views on the world. If you consider that all this was the Roman Empire, you of course had a huge amount of traditions and faiths and beliefs. And people knew of those different faiths and adopted to them. So this idea of good versus bad also made it into early Christianity. So this very young religion that built on older traditions. It particularly appears in apocryphic writings, so writings that didn't make it into the Bible. There are other versions of Christianity as well. And of course, the image of the devil was also inspired by all the gods, like the Gorgons of Greece, 3 sisters, one of them Medusa. If you look at them, they turn you to stone. And you probably know the image of Medusa, who has snakes for hair. They look at you directly. They have this grotesque large mouth. The tongue's out. There are these huge fangs here. So these are aspects that we also see here in the devil. I think you can see a little bit of a resemblance. Definitely the same family. Other gods or other stories were, for example, the satyrs or Pan, like the one depicted here. These are from Greek stories, and you can see that this god has horns and the legs of a goat. They were the gods of woodlands, of shepherds, of the wild. They liked music and dance. They were sometimes associated with Dionysus and with spring and fertility. And you can see how that fits in well with the image of the devil for the church. It kind of ties in with these fears of the body and the senses. This is a really cute picture, I think. It's of course from much later, it's from the 17th century. But the story is that the satyr was encountered by the farmer in the fields. And just in that moment, the farmer was blowing into his hands because they were a bit cold and he wanted to warm them up. He saw the satyr and invited him into the house to have dinner together. And right here you can see they're eating some kind of soup or stew with a spoon right here. And the farmer is again blowing, this time on his food in order to cool it, because it's still hot from the oven. And the satyr sees this and he says, no, this is basically devil's work. First you blow into your hands to warm them, and now you blow on the spoon to cool it. How can you do the same thing and achieve two different results? He doesn't trust it, so he's right here. You can see him. He's in the process of lifting himself up out of the chair, and he's going again. He wants nothing to do with that. Back in the Middle Ages, though, we have lots of different influences on the devil. So we don't just have horns and hoofs. You can see here these wings are more like bat wings. And these look like claws from some kind of bird. Here again we have a little devil that kind of looks like a bat. These two look like dogs with tails and paws. Down here we have horns again and a long beard. And then I really like the one here on the bottom. I'm not sure what it's inspired by. But he's having a good meal. These ones here look kind of more like reptiles or fish. Really strange creatures. This one has an extra face on its chest. That's pretty common, by the way. I thought this was a great opportunity to look through my music collection. And I remembered that I'd seen a face like this before here on this Bruce Dickinson cover. Again, a medieval devil. The face of a beast and then a human face here on its stomach. There are plenty of these images of devils eating away on the souls of the damned. And I think if you were a peasant in the Middle Ages, you couldn't read or write, you couldn't read the Bible yourself. You went to church, but the language of the church was Latin, and I'm not sure how much any random peasant would have understood at the time. So what you had to turn to were images, like these ones here, to tell you the story of your faith. And that looks pretty scary and gruesome. And the devil was present everywhere. The end of the Middle Ages, you also have the witch hunt, the Malleus Maleficarum, which was written at the time, the witch hammer. Here you have an image of a possession with the devil coming out of this woman. So really quite a scary image and quite a scary story. And it's not surprising that the devil turns up in a lot of folk tales as well. He comes to trick people. He kind of does the same thing that we talked about earlier. He tests people's strength. He tests their faith. And he also offers them something, something that they desire. There's a story, for example, of a little street in Vienna in the central district called Stoß im Himmel. A woman lived there in house number 3 who was extremely vain, and she was just into her outfits, her beauty. And one day she walked through the streets and saw a beggar there, a woman who offered her an incredibly beautiful dress. And naturally she didn't want to say no. She asked what the dress would cost, and the beggar said, well, nothing. All you have to do, on the 3rd day at midnight, you give me whatever the fabric of the dress covers. The lady thought, well, it's gonna be a bargain, that's great. I'm going to agree to that. So she took the dress, put it on. She was the star of Vienna for 3 days. But then at the end of the 3rd day, when night fell and she wanted to take it off, she made a horrible discovery. It wouldn't come off. She couldn't get out of the dress. And midnight approached. The beggar turned back up and she realized that it hadn't been some random poor woman in the streets. It was the devil who was coming to get her soul. And indeed, the whole dress burst into flames, kind of giving her a first taste of hell. But luckily, she had a little picture of Saint Barbara underneath the fabric. And Saint Barbara came down and gave her like a little push that pushed her out of the dress and saved her from hell. So it was like a push into heaven, einen Stoß in den Himmel. And the woman repented, she became a nun and eventually went to heaven. There's another story about the cathedral in Vienna. You might remember, I've told you before that it was supposed to have 2 towers, but only one was built. And the story, as you can see, the second one peeking out here, that Hans Buchbaum, who was supposed to build it, realized he couldn't manage it in the time that he said he was going to do it in. And then the devil appeared and said to him, well, don't worry, I'll do it for you. You'll get your rewards, you'll become famous, you'll be able to marry the woman that you want to marry. All you have to do is not say the name of God or of any saints or holy figures. And Hans Buchbaum figured, well, it's not going to be too hard, I'll agree to that. The only issue is that the woman he wanted to marry was called Maria. And sort of laid into the stage of building this tower, he was standing somewhere up there, looking down, and he saw Maria walking across the square. But she didn't look up, she didn't see him. And so he called down to her. He called her name, Maria. And at that moment, the entire tower crumbled. Everything fell back down. And the builder, Hans Buchbaum, disappeared and was never seen again. And well, the Catholic people of Vienna decided not to try a second time to build that tower. And while you have these sort of folk tales and medieval depictions, you then of course also have stories of the devil in high literature, such as in the Divina Commedia by Dante. Here's one famous illustration by William Bouguereau. This one's from the 19th century. The Divina Commedia was written in the 13th. So, what we would think of as the Middle Ages is more Renaissance in Italy. And Bouguereau decided to show us a devil with a skeletal face. I kind of love how he's looking pretty buff, really. But then you have these hollow eyes and that skull around it, plus the bat ears. The story that Dante tells, though, is a bit different. The devil is at the center of hell, and it doesn't look like this. Rather, the devil's frozen in the middle of a lake and has 3 faces, one red, one yellow, and one black. And as we see here, he has wings of a bat. And as he beats these wings, he creates an ice-cold wind that freezes the lake around him. And with his 3 faces, he's munching on 3 different people. On Brutus, on Gaius Cassius, and the central one is eating Judas Iscariot. The reason for Brutus and Gaius Cassius also has a bit to do with the situation in Italy at the time, and the thought that the people who'd murdered Julius Caesar were also responsible for this unified Italy falling apart. And then you have these many different kingdoms, duchies, etc. in the region that we think of as Italy today. I guess it's a bit wrong to say Italy fell apart because, of course, at the time it was the Roman Empire. So that's in the Italian language. In English, in the 17th century, we have Paradise Lost by John Milton, in which, again, the story of the devil is told, but in a bit of a different way. It kind of ties in with some of these apocryphal stories that I talked about earlier. So the ones that didn't make it into the official Bible, so to say. Paradise Lost tells the story of the fall of man and the temptation of Adam and Eve by Satan. Satan in the story appears as the snake in paradise that tempts Eve. And later, as punishment, is also turned into a snake. It's also the first time that Satan is called Lucifer. Lucifer means light bringer and also comes from older mythologies. The son of Eos, of dawn in Greek mythology, was the light bringer, Lucifer. Milton didn't think of his Satan as the hero of the story, but he made quite an impression, for example, here on William Blake, who illustrates Satan as a kind of glorious figure when you compare it to the other ones. You have stars here on these huge wings, You have what looks like fire coming out from the 7 faces. And in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, William Blake writes, the reason Milton wrote in fetters when he wrote of angels and gods, and at liberty when of devils and hell, is because he was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it. So you have the devil as a kind of anti-hero maybe, or at least as a really conflicted figure that is not just an ugly beast anymore reigning in hell, but rather some kind of prince of darkness. And they would later carry over into what would sort of develop into Satanism. I don't know if there's an actual Satanism, sort of what Aleister Crowley or LaVey did. A lot of people question that, whether you really can call it Satanism. But it inspired this figure that's seen as desirable and interesting, and really inspired a lot of youth culture and a lot of music culture. We'll get to that in a minute. But first, there's one more figure I want to get to. In the German language, the figure of the devil that appears in our school classes when we learn German is Mephistopheles from Faust. So Faust was a scholar. He was kind of really unhappy and torn. And Mephisto appears and again makes him an offer and tempts him. Faust agrees to it, and you can already see here in his studio where he has all of his scripts and books. There's a skull that foreshadows that the story doesn't end well. I have to admit, I saw Faust the first time in theatre this year and had a really hard time following it. I had a teacher who decided not to teach Faust. There's kind of a lot of reflection on what should go into a German language canon, and for her, she chose to focus more on more modern books. So I'm kind of learning about Faust now. It's quite an old story, though, so the story itself existed before Goethe wrote it down. And then there's this image that I really like by Georges de Feur, La Voix du Mal, the voice of evil. So we see this lady here leaning on a pillow, looking off into the distance, maybe daydreaming. And I guess we can see her daydream here. Something that wasn't deemed appropriate for women at the time. So this voice of evil in her is also a voice of rebellion against norms and authority, the authority of the church, authority of patriarchy. It can give more liberty. And that's how Satanism is often interpreted, as sort of just a hedonistic view of the world. You do what you want, whatever brings you joy and pleasure. You kind of give in to the temptation of the devil, right? And of course, it inspired a lot of youth culture. There's Black Sabbath. We see the skull, so this theme of death. We see temptation here. We see a snake. And the number of the beast, 666. We have it with Iron Maiden, the number of the beast, and a sort of more cliche figure of the devil in red with horns and a tail and the flames of hell down here. And of course, in a lot of subcultures, this is just an imagery to play with. Some, like in black metal, take it more seriously. There's Bathory with a goat. That might be Baphomet here in the back. Baphomet was a creature that the Templars were accused of worshipping. Some god that they were accused to have picked up in the Holy Land. There are bands like Darkthrone that have the pentagram here in their logo. And of course, black metal's probably most well known for, or became really famous for, the burning of churches. The legions come, again legion, a demon of hell. And with that, gonna finish our little look at the devil. I wish you a very spooky week leading up to Halloween. And I will see you again in November. Until then, thank you for watching and good night.